Welcome to this lecture, which is part of the series of lectures by eminent persons by Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. Professor Kondapalli is Professor Chinese Studies and former Chairman of Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Kondapalli will speak on the India-China-US strategic triangle, competition, contestation and cooperation. May I request our President, Mr. Yatin Kapurkar, and the co-chair, Dattesh Parurikar, to kindly accompany Professor Kondapalli to the dais. Please welcome Professor Kondapalli with our This lecture, as I said earlier, is part of the series of lectures that ICC started about 3 years ago, where we invite eminent persons from different backgrounds to speak to the open audience. May I request our President, Mr. Yatin Kapurkar, who is also co-chair of this lecture, to kindly make his welcome remarks.
Good evening, Professor Kondapalli, Mr. Parulekar, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic today relates to India, China, US. Let me make some very brief remarks. Since independence, India's focus of foreign policy has been mainly on Pakistan, and then secondly was China. Things are going to change in the coming years. Our focus, our emphasis with China will definitely be greater than it has been in all these years. In many ways, India has been nudged into accepting China's preeminence by none other than the United States of America. It was George Bush who came to India some years ago, and he was the one who was very keen that India assumes the role of a counterweight to China. Then there was some gap for some time. Now we see Barack Obama has also come recently, and he also seems to be asking India to play the role of an effective counterweight to China. So it is the combination of these three countries, India, China and America, that is going to dominate India's foreign policy in the years to come. Unlike India's focus mainly on Pakistan all these years. And this is what Professor Kondapalli will be talking about, India, China and America. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With the immense contribution in the field, Professor Kondapalli's profile runs into pages. So may I request the co-chair, Mr. Dattesh Parurikar, Assistant Professor at Center for Latin American Studies in Goa University, to briefly introduce Professor Kondapalli and then invite him to make his presentation.
Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure to have a person of the eminence of Professor Kondapalli. In fact, if one looks at his entire CV, I think one can say in one sentence that it's an embodiment of scholarship. A very incisive and prolific commentator on all issues concerning China. He's of course proficient in the language, which matters a lot when it comes to studying China and examining various parameters of China. But also more importantly, he has traveled to China, he has taught in China, which gives him unique insights on the transpirings within China, and therefore the better position to comment on China's role and also the India-China relationship. He's of course Professor of Chinese Studies at the JNU. He has been chairman of the Center for East Asian Studies on 2 occasions, between 2008 and 2010, and 2012 and 2014. He learned Chinese language at Beijing Language and Culture University and was a postdoctoral visiting fellow at the People's University Beijing between 1996 and 1998. He has been a visiting professor at National Chengchi University Taipei in 2004, a visiting professor at Shandong University Jinan in 2011, 2011 and 2013, and also a fellow at Salzburg Global Seminar. He's written 2 books, 2 monographs, quoted in 3 volumes, and has a number of articles in journals to his credit. Most importantly, he has also been the proud recipient of the K. Subramaniam Award in 2010 for excellence in research in strategic and security studies. And for common people, Mr. Subramaniam has been the father of strategic and security studies in this country. I think the topic and the formulation that we have made today is a very intriguing and a very curious one. In the global world order, which is marked by interconnectedness and interdependence, relations between major states are very complex and multi-layered. What's more, in the case of India, the new government has attached great significance to its relations with China and America. Just a simple fact makes it very evident. Mr. Modi will be going to Beijing in May, and as and when he does that, it will mean that within the first year of his primeship, there will have been 2 India-US summits and 2 India-China summits. I think that itself shows that there is great importance attached to this relationship, and the manner in which India can balance the perspectives of Beijing and Washington would, I think, determine the future course of this country's rise. So with these words, let me invite Professor Kondapalli to commence his lecture today.
Let me thank first the International Center and the Goa University for the invite, and also for your patience in listening to this interaction on the India-China-US relations. What I would suggest is that we will first go through a few slides on initially US and China, because that's more strategic. It had acquired a lot of mass in the last 20-25 years, from 1970 to Nixon's visit to Beijing. From then on, China-US relations have acquired a lot of depth, what we now call this as strategic in nature. We also see that for the last 11 years, there is also been US-India relations are becoming strategic in nature, with the 123 agreement and subsequently various other agreements that have been signed between US and India. We also have a subtle trilateral relationship between US, China and India. It is subtle because as Mr. Parlekar had mentioned, there is the visits by between India and US twice, and we will have Prime Minister Modi's visit in May in a couple of months to Beijing. All this suggests that there is a kind of equation evolving. As also Mr. Kapoor mentioned, there is there is the trilateral relations becoming very kind of deep. For instance, the Manmohan Singh once told Hu Jintao that we are not part of the containment of China. This was about 3 years ago in a discussion with them, with the Chinese president. We also see that some of the unwritten, not to be quoted, phrases in US-India relations also included some projects which possibly the Chinese see as containment of China. We also saw US-China relations as part of containment. Remember, Henry Kissinger had all those mouthful words for Indira Gandhi in 1971 during the Bangladesh Liberation War. We have also seen Chow Lai in the Woodrow Wilson Institute declassified documents. He had Chow Lai, the premier, also was bad-mouthing Indian leaders and suggesting to a kind of growing relationship with the United States at that time. Some of these declassified documents have spoken about those relations between US, China, and now India, US. There is also the India-China context. As we saw, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, came to India just before Prime Minister Modi was about to take over as the Prime Minister last May. He came as a special envoy, which is a huge change in the Chinese. Because the foreign minister in the Chinese hierarchy is number 4 or number 5 down the line. Because the Politburo Standing Committee is supreme in China. And those who connected to the Politburo Standing Committee are the movers and shakers in the Chinese system, which suggests that Wang Yi's position, the Chinese foreign minister's position, is pretty low in the hierarchy. Yet he was appointed as a special envoy of the president, who is also the general secretary of the Politburo Standing Committee chairman. Which indicated that they have had a very high level kind of signaling in May last year. Also, Li Keqiang spoke to Prime Minister Modi for about 45 minutes soon after Mr. Modi took over as the Prime Minister. All this suggests India and China angle is also getting strengthened. Of course, there are so many issues in the India-China context. There is an unresolved territorial dispute. There is Chinese suspicion on India about the Tibet issue and the Dalai Lama presence in India. There is the Indian suspicion about the nuclear dimension of relations between China and Pakistan. There is also the Chinese role in the Indian Ocean region, which has become kind of acute, which we saw, as a result of which we saw Prime Minister Modi's visit recently last week to Mauritius, Seychelles and Sri Lanka. So at a preliminary level, we see that this topic indeed is significant today. There is a certain trilateral kind of template which is emerging, which we need to kind of analyze. So my suggestion is first we look at the China-US relations, which have acquired a lot of depth, and we look at the US-India-China relations as a whole. With this brief, I would go into the next few slides. Okay, the context of US-India-China relations is that there is the economic aspects. Some time ago, the economists had suggested to the changing global economic hierarchy, and they mentioned 3 years ago how the US GDP is pretty high at about $13 trillion. Today it's about $17 trillion last year, with per capita income of $45,000 and a population which is under 300 million people. China, roughly $7 trillion of GDP, per capita income of about $5,000, and population is pretty high at 1.42 billion people. In the case of Japan, similar story where they were the second largest economy till 2010, but declining because of the deflationary pressures and so on. India is another where they see that this is the fourth largest in terms of GDP figures, where you have an emerging equation. There are rest of the other countries based on these three categories. The World Bank had suggested by 2030 the hierarchy could be possibly changing, and they suggested that US is overall declining from overall in the sense that although they are increasing in terms of GDP, but they are not able to kind of catch up with the Chinese expansion in the GDP figures. So they argue about the $22 trillion of GDP that China will be able to acquire by 2030, and Japan declining, India increasing its GDP by about $8.7 trillion, and the rest, EU 27 as the largest, but 27 countries as part of that conglomeration. So the economic hierarchy here suggests to a major transformation in the next few decades' time. This is reinforced by the BRICS report, the Goldman Sachs report, which had argued till about 2050 the Chinese GDP would have crossed about $72 trillion, while the US would have reached about $37 trillion and India about $32 trillion. So they argued that based on productive assets, savings and other indicators, the US will be the number 2, China will be number 1, and India number 3. So that's the rough hierarchy, economic hierarchy, which has been suggested by some of these reports which have come up in the recent period. We do not know the veracity of these, but possibly we can start with that discussion. If so and so, then what could be the trilateral kind of relation? Now, between US and China, we see that there are very few visits between the two leaders. Obama only visited once. Of course, he visited the APEC summit meeting last November, but the US president had visited only once China in 2009. The other presidents as well were very economical in terms of their visits to China, which suggests that there is something which is holding back at the highest political level. Even the Chinese have not been very frequent to the US, and actually initially some of these visits have actually become very controversial. With the Tibetans, the Taiwanese, and human rights lobbies and other lobbies demonstrating outside the White House, there has been a huge kind of controversy to the Chinese leaders' visits to United States. Xi Jinping visited California last June, and they cobbled up what is called as a new type of major power relations. The new type of major power relations is supposed to be characterized by what they say as non-conflictual, non-confrontation. Secondly, win-win cooperation. One doesn't know what exactly it means, but they keep repeating these win-win cooperation. We actually see substantially there are differences between China and the United States on major issues. Yet there is this new type of major power relations which has emerged between the US and China. 1979 February visit by Deng Xiaoping to the White House was a major strategic shift in the global events. And some contended that President Bush's visit to New Delhi in 2005 was equally having a strategic transformation content with the 123 agreement. This is the visit where 3-4 major issues were addressed or discussed and finalized. One is the United States will not cross the line in the Taiwan Straits, meaning that US will not support Taiwan independence movement. Second most important thing, the Chinese got an assurance from the United States is that US will help China to grow up, to rise. So from then on, substantially there is the shift in the US multinational companies, various others, the MFN status, the WTO entry, and today the TPP discussions, informally, not so formally, and the APEC FTA, which was signed last November. All these are part of that huge change in the US in relation to China. Remember, the US targeted the Soviet Union, and Ronald Reagan sometimes said the Soviet Union is the Satan for the United States, and both of them entered into a Cold War conflict and an arms race, an ideological conflict between capitalism and socialism and democracy and so on. So that divide does not exist with the Chinese, at least in terms of the Enemy Act, which is basically related to trade between United States and the communist countries. That has been lifted for China, while the Enemy Act was present for the Soviet Union. And so what we now have is between US and China a kind of understanding on economic issues, on global strategic issues, a host of issues. So China rise was a major consequence of this understanding between Deng Xiaoping and President Carter in 1979. The third issue that they discussed, which remained a major contentious point, was how to counter the then Soviet Union. In 1979, the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan between 79 to 89, and this has been a major contentious point for both the Chinese and the United States. So the Chinese helped the Soviet Union, the United States to counter the Soviet Union. In what ways? Kevin Paul Peter writes for the Rand Corporation by basing his arguments on declassified documents, suggesting that the United States substantially helped China in the military field. The Peace Pearl program that the former US Defense Secretary started with China included arms transfers, technology transfers, and also cutting-edge technologies transfers to China, including satellite guidance systems which can be used for missile trajectories. The second thing the Chinese did for the United States is to help the US to track the Soviet movements in Afghanistan. So the NATO had several projects in Xinjiang and other places to monitor the Soviet troop movements. Third most important is to contain the Soviet influence, which towards the eastern side, including Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and Africa and Asia, in other parts of Asia, there has been an understanding between the US and the Chinese on both of them trying to disintegrate the Soviet Union. Disintegrate the Soviet Union was a very strong word, of course. The Chinese never agreed to this concept, but yet there is the project that is running through between US and China in Afghanistan and subsequently. As we all know, Soviet Union disintegration is partly traced to their setback in Afghanistan with so many thousands of Soviet troops killed in the Afghan operations. So the visit to the United States was very useful for China, and these three main understandings were crucial for the subsequent global history. We see that by 1991, Soviet Union is gone, China enters into the Central Asian republics. China becomes a major beneficiary of trade-related. China had risen partly with US subsidies in global security issues. So much so today, China had become the largest exporting country. China does not pay for any counter-piracy operations or any stability-related issues in the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean region. Of course, in the Indian Ocean region, they have, from 2008, they have sent 19 contingents to the Gulf of Aden operations. Yet, overall, if you look at the global transfers, innocent trade transfers across the maritime domain, China hardly contributed to the security of these global commons, meaning in terms of the upkeep of these global commons. So this is the basic understanding between US and China, and US and China substantially benefited out of this understanding. Now, this slide tries to explain the cooperation and competition between US and China. Zalmay Khalilzad, who used to work with the Rand Corporation and became ambassador in Afghanistan, he's an Afghan origin, American, became an ambassador in Afghanistan, an ambassador in Iraq, and various other positions. Zalmay Khalilzad introduced the word congagement, which is somewhere between containment and engagement. Congagement is also happening between China and the US. So let's look at some of the strategic cooperation issues. There is huge trade, $580 billion, which is the largest in the globe today between two countries, individual countries, huge investments either side. The US had invested several $billion in the China market and had nudged its companies like Microsoft, Motorola, you name it, they have invested in the China market. Chinese are also investing in the US last 2 to 3 years. A decade ago, the Unicol deal by the US Congress was cut. But today, the Lenovo company had taken over the IBM, and a host of other mergers and acquisitions are happening by the Chinese companies of the American companies. Secondly, there is also the Chinese investments of $1.2 trillion in the US Treasury securities, which kind of subsidizes the US economy. And most of the time, the US Treasury Secretary keeps on going to Beijing at least 4 to 5 times a year. He doesn't come to New Delhi, he doesn't go to Tokyo, he doesn't go to Berlin, he doesn't go to as often as he goes to Beijing. So, which indicates to the depth in the financial relations between US and China. Investments are increasing and there is also an understanding on proliferation, especially on the North Korean six-party talks. There has been some understanding between the US and the Chinese to rope in the North Koreans on the nuclear issue, although it is not quite successful because the North Koreans have stated that they tested the nuclear device thrice. Overall, they do cooperate on the nuclear non-proliferation, missile proliferation related issues. On the Iranian nuclear issue as well, there is some coordination between the US and China. China increasingly is also supporting the US veto on the Iranian nuclear issue. At least 4 times the Chinese have backed the US decisions and now are a part of the P5+1 or EU 3+3. P5, all the permanent 5 in the United Nations Security Council plus Germany or European Union 3+3 other countries. So in terms of proliferation issues, there has been some coordination. Also, speaking about India, there was a coordination between China and the United States in 1998 as well as in 2009. In 1998, when the Clinton administration had proposed the 1172 resolution in the United Nations Security Council, China backed that resolution. And we all know that the resolution said, cap, roll back, eliminate the South Asian nuclear capability potential. Which suggests the US-China understanding on WMD issues has become a major strategic cooperative effort. Fourthly, there is also both China and United States keep mentioning in their documents that they are for peace and stability of the international system, that China is a status quo power. It has some problems with some provisions in climate change, in other issues, but overall it defends the international system. So both use the same words as peace and security and stability of the international system. What does that exactly mean? The Chinese used to depict China as non-enemy, non-friend. It's neither an enemy nor a friend. Incidentally, China is using this phrase now to India at this moment. India is a non-enemy, non-friend. But they used to use this in the 70s and 80s to the United States. So we are roughly at the level between India and China. The Chinese perceive India as a non-enemy, non-friend. Of course, on climate change, on energy, on BRICS and so on, the Chinese do say that we are friends, but they do not exactly say friends. The word friend doesn't arise in that. What they depicted to the United States was non-enemy, non-friend at that point of time. And then in 2009, the United States suggested, you're growing up, China is becoming big in terms of economy. Now China needs to be a security provider. China needs to be a responsible power. For this, when Wolfowitz suggested the responsible stakeholder concept to China, the Chinese said we are always responsible. We never rock the boat. We always protected the international system and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, we see that today Chinese have been, including this month, when Premier Li Keqiang made the work report to the National People's Congress, he mentioned this word that we are a responsible power. Which indicates that both have a common understanding at the global security level. There is also the strategic reassurance provided by Obama administration in the #1 administration. And in 2009, Obama went to the extent of suggesting a G2. As you know, Brzezinski had suggested the G2. G2 basically, Washington DC and Beijing will involve in all regional and global issues. They coordinate events and address the international and regional security issues. G2 was problematic for New Delhi as it is problematic for Tokyo or to London or to Berlin or to Paris or even to Moscow. G2 meant everyone will get marginalized on this count. But Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski, the US Embassy in Beijing, along with the China Reform Forum, which is part of the Central Party School, conducted several meetings on this concept of G2. While explicitly rejecting the concept of G2, implicitly both have had several projects on the G2. So that's very important. We need to understand that the US-China relations are becoming kind of strategic in nature. The operative word that is used in China-US relations is that they have a constructive cooperative partnership. Constructive cooperative partnership, which is important to understand in which way they are moving. It's, as I mentioned before, the California meeting in 2013 mentioned about non-conflict, non-confrontation. Because the stakes are high, because if the Chinese take initiative for any action and an unintended or an intended consequence resulting in a conflict between US and China, the Chinese have everything to lose in this transition period. So there is the non-conflict, non-confrontation proposed by Xi Jinping to Obama in the new type of major power relations. And also there is coordination between China and the US on the counterterrorism area. In Afghanistan, the Chinese position is that they supported the US in the UNSC on post 9/11 events in Afghanistan, while not putting the boots on the ground in Kabul and other places. Yet the Chinese have coordinated in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of Hawala transactions, countering, in terms of indirect logistic support provided through the counter-terrorism operation in Afghanistan. And also as an indirect measure to invest in Afghanistan for the economic stability of Afghanistan. So there is a lot going on in the counter-terrorism related issue. There is also a specific energy dialogue apart from a strategic and economic dialogue. Some 5 meetings of these dialogues have happened between the two, which suggests that the relations are getting much more intense between US and China. Having said that, there is also competition between the two sides. There is at the political level, at the economy level, diplomatic level, military level, there is huge competition emerging between China and the United States. At the political level, there is the democracy, human rights. Chen Guangchang, who was a lawyer in Shantung province, he was given a visa to go to the United States. He was one of the dissidents. He is visually impaired. He now had been teaching in several universities in the United States. US supports the pro-democracy rights activists after the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. Becomes a kind of contentious issue at the ideological political level. There is also the human rights related issue, which is also pretty intense between the two sides. The Americans release some human rights violation related documents. The Chinese also today are releasing documents related to or reports related to discrimination against the blacks or Hispanics or others in the United States, saying that US track record of human rights is also problematic. So in other words, a kind of Cold War situation emerging between the two on this issue. At the economy level, the United States previously was suggesting to the imbalance in trade Out of $580 billion of bilateral trade, Chinese exports constitute nearly about $460 billion, which means huge surplus trade that they have with the United States. So initially, for the first 2 decades, the United States had contended that the Chinese should address the balance of payments position on the trade. But today, the United States is looking at more at the renminbi, the Chinese yuan convertibility, and its relation to the US dollar. So currency-related issues, market status, market economy status. One of the issues here is why Walmart had been opened up for the Chinese exports. China had not opened up its energy sector, telecom sector, finance and insurance, defense sector, and security sector to the competition for the other players, including from the United States. So market economy status was stressed in terms of addressing this imbalance in trade positions. This is also a key argument that India had been saying for the last 4 years. President Pratibha Patil first raised this issue of trade imbalance between India and China in 2010 during her visit to Beijing. So India also had similar growls on the Chinese on the market economy status. But nothing is happening, and if Chinese hold back, they don't open up their market to foreign competition till 2016, that's where the WTO status for market economy will have to be given to the Chinese, regardless of what their position now currently to various countries. So the market economy status related issues are also very important. Then, like in the case of India, where India generally shies away from Chinese investments in the security fields. For example, there was a proposal some 4 or 5 years ago that China wanted to invest in Mumbai Port Trust. As we all know, Mumbai Port Trust is about 1 kilometer from the Mumbai naval base. So the Indian Navy suggested that we not give the contracts. Dredging projects to the Chinese company. It's too close to the security field. Likewise, for the United States, there is the concern about China entering into some of these closer to the security fields. So investments in the security fields has been kind of blocked in the United States. So what China is doing in the mergers and acquisitions is only at the very low level. Although most of the Pentagon computers are China origin, most of the defense industry computer systems are also from China, made in China. Foxconn has offices in China because of the labor issues. So there are subtle security issues emerging in this. There is the IPR related, intellectual property rights issue, also is a contentious issue between US and China in the economic field. At the diplomatic level, there is a US suspicion that China is cooperating with what the Bush administration has said the axis of evil of countries of concern, Iraq, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, various other countries. So this is one issue that is between US and China, which emerges as a kind of competition between the two. While US has alliances with Japan, South Korea, and is now improving relations with Philippines and Vietnam and Singapore, the Chinese are also doing the same way in terms of cooperating with those countries of concern. China accuses United States of following hegemony and power politics. This is a standard word that the Chinese use in all their white papers to criticize the United States. Not by name, but it is clear from. There is also the soft power contest between the two. Most of the Pew public opinion trends, the Chicago Business Council public opinion trends, the Gallup poll public opinion trends, there is a huge tussle going on between the US and China on the soft power related issues. This is where China is also contesting with the Chinese TV acquiring huge lands in New York or in other places. There is an effort now that China is contesting this soft power issue with the United States. Finally, the competition is reflected in the military field. There is the BMD system. The United States had decided in May 2001 to deploy, to go away from the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile defense treaty, and go now for the BMD system, ballistic missile defense system. Taiwan is acquiring the Patriot advanced combat systems. South Korea, Japan, possibly India in future, Singapore, and other countries. So for China, Taiwan acquiring the BMD systems is problematic from the sovereignty point of view. So there is a lot of competition emerging. But the most crucial thing is about the global commons in the military field. Maritime issues, United States is a pretty active participant in the East Asian Summit, in the ASEAN Regional Forum, in the Shangri-La dialogues in Singapore every June. So the maritime issues have come to the fore between the two sides. Then there is the cyber warfare which has been identified as the #2 challenge for the United States, emanating from China. And thirdly, in terms of the space-based systems, there is also a subtle competition in the space that is happening between the US and China. So strategic cooperation, strategic competition between the two, and then juxtaposed between these, you have what Zalmay Khalilzad said, engagement, containment plus engagement. So the US rebalance strategy includes that engagement strategy, which means constructive cooperative partnership with China, yet at the same time to see that China rise is according to the US wishes. So this slide tries to explain the cooperative competitive trends between the US and China. There are several flashpoints, and I will not dwell on this much. On Taiwan, on various incidents, there is also what was made by Clinton administration as an accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. There was the Cox report which had accused Lee Min-ho of transferring the miniaturized nuclear weapon programs to China. Then there is the EP3 incident. There is also the training of the US submarines, US vessels, and so on and so forth. So all this indicates that the flashpoints are testing the bilateral relations. Although in the last 3 decades, from 1972, the China and US did not fight a war. In other words, they maintained strategic stability. While the Cobra incident had kind of derailed the US-India relations to some extent in the last few months, there were no flashpoints which have derailed the US-China relations. So this is one we need to look at closely to see how the Chinese leaders have made that arrangement with the United States on. There were more differences coming up between US and China, and US role in South China Sea has been identified as a major flashpoint in the US-China relations. So, and currently the US rebalancing has been identified as a major difference between US and China. What does US rebalancing, how does it look like? As Tom Donilon mentioned, it includes 5 elements. Number 1, strengthening alliances to reinforce the US leadership. Looking at the partnerships with friends and allies, then strengthening the international system with cooperative constructive partnership with China. Then there is the regional initiative, shaping up the regional initiative like the TPP and so on, and economic architecture in the future. So these are part of the US rebalancing. The Chinese think the US rebalancing is to contain China. And so there is a huge concern on the rebalancing strategy. US and China conduct huge, lengthy strategic dialogues. 5 were concluded by 6 were concluded by 2014. The 2013 meeting was very important because they looked at cybersecurity, they looked at climate change, they looked at the military-to-military relations. While not much is happening in the mil-mil relations, there is, on climate change deal last November, this has been a huge kind of trendsetter, which has been sold also to Prime Minister Modi during the January visit by Obama to Delhi. Then there is the market access and protection of intellectual property rights. In addition to this, US conducts 60 other structured dialogues with the Chinese. We have about 30 dialogues between India and US, while between China and US there are about 60 dialogues on various issues, energy, economic, and so on. Trade is increasing. This has become a crucial point between the two, but there are some contentious issues. The Tibet issue, recent visit by the Dalai Lama with Obama, not exactly in the Oval Room, but in the Apple Room or in other places in the White House, had resulted in some tension between the two sides. The US had elevated its equation on Tibet by appointing an Under-Secretary of State for Tibetan Affairs. She is generally, Paula Dobriansky previously and Ortega now, Maria Ortega now, she is generally informally called as Ambassador to Tibet in the US administration. Whenever she is addressed, she is called as the Ambassador to Tibet. So, in other words, the US had kind of escalated its position on Tibet, and they are looking at major issues. And Maria Ortega keeps visiting India, Dharamshala, and other places to look at what the Tibetans want on this issue. While the US had recognized that Tibet is part of China, US also recognized that the Tibetans should not play kind of violent role in their free Tibet movement, etc., etc. The US has a basic understanding with China on that issue of Tibet as a part of China. Yet we have seen some escalation on the naming of the Undersecretary of State for the Tibetan affairs. She is actually for religious affairs, and Tibet is her main kind of preoccupation. So these are some issues that have come to the fore in the recent period. At the strategic level, of course, there is the conflict that is emerging. China is also carefully looking at some of the discussions in the United States. United States in the last 200 years followed 3 policies. One is isolationism, which is, we don't want to intervene anywhere. We are separated by the Atlantic and the Pacific, except 9/11, which brought the war to the United States. Otherwise, the United States is pretty far away from any other global events. It is cushioned between these 2 huge oceans. So it has followed this isolationism. So there are some debates in the United States that US should go back to isolationism as its policy. There are others who suggest to offshore balancing, that is strengthening the alliances with Japan, South Korea, and expanding with Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, and now with India in soft ways. So that is a dominant theme in the US foreign policy. The third is selective engagement, which includes permanently stationing US troops in those regions to help maintain peace. So Diego Garcia, Guam, St. Darwin, all these were traced as part of that selective engagement policy and intervention in need, if in need, for those stability-related issues. So there are debates within the US on the larger issues in the last decade or so, which China is closely watching on the US. The Chinese assessment on the US is it is a declining power. Increasingly, all the Chinese, majority of the opinion in Chinese scholarship policy circles, they keep saying that US is a declining power. Of course, we have seen from the Bush administration, they taking the help of the allies in the Iraq war, in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in various places. The US had, unlike previously during the Cold War, it is now increasingly banking on the allies. So the US, the Chinese today think that the US is a declining power. That is a major point of departure in the policy and politics service. The debates within the US on the direction that the US is going to take also are in tune with the Chinese discussions related to a US decline. In the light of this, it is where we figure out, Indians will figure out on if the Chinese assessment of a US decline and US suggesting to a rebalance strategy towards the Asia Pacific. And this is where we configure. This is where India configures in various ways. Number one, India configures in the AFRICOM. As we all know, the United States had announced the Africa Command and the areas of responsibilities that we mentioned, although now currently Bahrain will look after some of these responsibilities. Bahrain is where you have the 5th fleet located, and they look after the overall Africa Command related issues. But in future, they would like to set up, if the US economy revives, there is a high growth rate in the US economy, possibly at that point of time, if resources are there, then the US would probably have the AFRICOM. But in AFRICOM, there is substantial coordination between US, Japan, and India. We have had a lot of discussions on the African context. Where does India figure out in from the US point of view? We have seen the signals coming up in the National Security Strategy, QDR, and the National Intelligence Council report, which all mentioned compared the China front and the India front by the United States. And so this suggests to the policy options that the US has towards China or India. With India in 2002, after Clinton visit, and the Bush administration coming closer to India with various arrangements, including the nuclear field, it stated that India and US possibly could come up together for a strategically stable Asia, and in the Indian Ocean and a series of other places. In the case of China, unlike in the Soviet Union's case where US contended with the Soviet Union, contained the Soviet Union, here the national security strategy says we welcome the emergence of a strong, peaceful, prosperous China, which is kind of completely different from when we compare the other socialist state, which is the Soviet Union. We welcome the emergence of a strong, peaceful, and prosperous China. So the bottom line has been that we welcome the rise of China from the view. Of course, they have the ideological conflict on democracy in China. They have the conflict related to the character of the Communist Party-controlled state in China. And they have also concerns about the rising defense budget in China. This is one major aspect that the United States has been stressing, including currently on the freedom of navigation related issues. So that's how US started looking at India and China in two different ways. While there is a certain shared values, and Vajpayee's visit to Washington DC mentioned for the first time about natural allies. US and India as natural meaning here democracies coming together. The NSS in 2010, similar picture was painted between the US positions on China and US positions on India. So let me skip this because almost verbatim statements in this. President Obama made the speech in the Indian Parliament in 2010. That is completely different from what he said about when he met with Hu Jintao in 2011. United States welcomes China's rights, but human rights need to be protected. That's the US position regarding China. In the case of India, he mentioned about the shared interests and shared values, and he endorsed the Indian candidature in the United Nations Security Council. He said we welcome India into the, of course he did not mention welcome when, now or 100 years later. It's not clear from his statement that it is ambiguous on when exactly the United Nations Security Council will be reorganized, reformed, etc. The last month, the National Security Strategy came out with a revision. It also mentions in the light of Obama's visit to India. It mentions about India in terms of cooperation in security, energy, environment, a regional provider of security. And we see a strategic convergence with India's Act East Asia policy, which has been changed after Prime Minister Modi went to Washington in September last year. We changed from Look East to Act East policy, and so Obama is reiterating this position. But the last paragraph also is very interesting. He now brings up the hyphenation between India and Pakistan on the South Asian and Central Asian stability-related issues. In the case of China, the NSS follows what has been mentioned in the last nearly 10 years about the territorial disputes becoming problematic for the neighboring states, climate change, public health, economic growth, denuclearization of the current peninsula, the rules and regulations in the international system, cyber security, maritime issues. All these have been mentioned as part of contentious issues between US and China last month again by the United States. So you have a different picture emerging for both India and China from the United States point of view. Where does the trilateral relations come in? I did not emphasize much on the US and India relations, but this slide will provide some response to that. We saw in the case of China, the United States welcomed its rights. However, there were the arms embargoes imposed after the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. The arms embargo still continues to China, although China is able to procure equipment from Israel, Russia, and even European Union in terms of systems, not in terms of entire platforms. If you go to CIPRI website, you find that the Europeans did transfer, even now, are transferring even now some of these equipment. Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea, Senkaku Islands. United States supports the Japanese position that Senkaku Islands belong to Japan. But the United States did not clarify that the alliance between US and Japan includes issues related to the Senkaku Islands. They did not clarify, indicating the ambiguity on when exactly will the US will come to rescue of Japan. Kurt Campbell had suggested that if the Chinese fire across the Japanese, then possibly the US will invoke the security alliance between US and Japan. If the Japanese fire against the Chinese, then possibly they will not bring in the alliance formation between US and Japan. So a lot of ambiguity for the Japanese. It's also a lesson for those countries which want to become alliance partners with the United States. Japan pays $3 to $4 billion a year to the upkeep of the US troops in Okinawa and other places. And so far they paid roughly 50-60 billion dollars for these troops in Okinawa. Japan paid 1/4 of the budget for the Gulf War in 1991. 1/4 of the budget was borne by the Japanese during that time. So for the Japanese, it's really frustrating that the alliance is not being invoked in the case of the CENTAUR particles. We have also seen, having said that there are differences between US and China. US and China coordinated when it came to the India issue. For example, in 1971, you have the Bangladesh Liberation War, the Chinese were, we were in alliance partnership with the Soviet Union. We were in the wrong camp according to the Americans at that point of time. In 1998, the US and China passed the 1172 resolution. During this time, Vajpayee wrote that letter to Clinton saying, we have to go to Pokhran 2 because the neighborhood is becoming rowdy, and indirectly mentioning China, WMD transfers to Pakistan as a reason for going to war. In 2009 again, the G2 has been subscribed by the US to suggested to China. So when we look at the US, not only that they have acquired a lot of depth, but there is a certain understanding on South Asian issues and others, sometimes to the detriment of the Indian interests. How about US and India relations? Now, in the last decade, substantial transformation took place in the US-India relations. Starting from the February 2005 speech by Condoleezza Rice in Sophia University. In this speech, she said, and deliberately she had chosen Tokyo, because Tokyo was the military ally for the United States. So she said in this speech, we want to help India to become a major power in 21st century. We do not know why the US wants to help India to become a global power in 21st century. But what is important is that there is the China factor emerging. Condoleezza Rice, the neocon at that point of time, were concerned about China rise. Bush administration treated at one point of time China as a strategic competitor. He made that speech in May 2001. So there is, prior to 9/11, so there is that issue between the US and China. So Condoleezza Rice's speech was that basically Japan cannot provide the strategic depth, strategic support to the US in Asia in 21st century. It is India which can provide the strength to the United States. So she was arguing that we need to do a transformation similarly as Nixon did in 1972. That we need to have a different kind of world order in which the relations with India has to be enhanced. So since then, after the 10-year defense cooperation agreement was signed, we have concluded over $10 billion of arms trade with the United States. And Nancy Powell, the former ambassador to India, she said in the next 4 to 5 years' time, India is going to acquire $10 more billion from the United States. So we now have about $20 billion worth of arms from the United States. Is what the this is for the capacity build-up, as they said, that India could sustain operations in the event of. So most of the equipment that the Indians are buying from the United States are all deployed on the China front. The C-130Js are deployed in the Dollar Bay Goldie sector. The light artillery, when Panetta visited Delhi in 2010, we signed a $1.2 billion deal on the light artillery deal. Most of this light artillery is for the China front, because the China front is mountainous, and so the artillery pieces are kind of useful for that purpose. During that time, we also had initial interest in the Apache helicopters. Again, these are meant for the China front. Then electronic warfare equipment that we purchased from the United States is again for the China front. So whichever way you look at, most of these equipment are going to the China front. So in other words, there is a certain China angle to these arms kind of sales from United States. Interestingly, Ashton Carter, who was then the pointsman for the arms sales, now the secretary. Ashton Carter once said, and it's a very powerful expression that he suggested. He said, defense ties are the basis for the bilateral relations. If you carefully analyze this sentence, defense ties are the basis for the entire bilateral relations, political, economic, diplomatic, strategic, etc., etc. Defense ties are the basis for these bilateral relations. It's a very powerful comment that he made, which indicates that there is a lot going on between US and India on that front. We have the Malabar exercises without fail we have conducted for the last 17 or 18 years. And the interoperability principle is increasing between the two. Both suggest from Vajpayee's visit to Washington DC as natural allies. United States recognized in 1962 that McMahon Line is the boundary between India and China. Very few countries have stated this. Remember last year the Japanese foreign minister stated that south of McMahon Line belongs to that of India, and the Chinese issued a démarche to the Japanese, and the foreign minister of Japan dropped his references, saying he was misquoted, etc. So very few countries have said that the McMahon Line is the basis for the United States clarified, the State Department and the US ambassador clarified about this position. So in other words, they took a position in 62 which still continues on the territorial related issue. And also we have not seen the US saying, no US leader, official, said anything about Kashmir from 1993. The last time a US leader spoke about the Kashmir issue was Robin Rafiq, who was now in dock when there is a lot of Pakistani connection to her. But she was the last person to have said something about Kashmir. Of course, Obama said something about Kashmir, but as a candidate in the elections, he made that comment to the Time magazine, but we have not seen any official statements on Kashmir. On the other hand, we actually see Chinese revising their Kashmir issue. China today, when Nawaz Sharif visited Beijing last November, they promised $45 billion as part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And everything of that, most of that, has to pass through the POK and the northern areas. That is the physical connection between Pakistan and China. So we see two different perspectives from the US and China on the Kashmir, on the territorial related issues. So the choices for India are pretty clear on this. US-India trade is over $100 billion. The investments also quite huge between US into India. Indian mergers and acquisitions in the US are also increasing. The steel and other companies have been investing in the US or allied markets. So we have had several exercises, Navy, land, air exercises almost every year. The Operation Turquoise was very interesting because that was held in Leh, which is, as you know, next to Tibet, next to China. And so that was, the Operation Turquoise was a crucial exercise. We have strategic dialogues, some 30 dialogues between US and India. There is the quadrilateral which is now being revived. In 2005, that was shut down after the Chinese complained. The Australians backed off, the Japanese backed off, and finally we have this quadrilateral now being revived. There is a trilateral between US, India and Japan. Regularly, the joint secretary level meetings take place on that issue. The joint secretary East Asia, who is related to China-related issues, is in charge of the trilateral with the United States, which indicates that there is indeed a China connection for that aspect. we also are making explicit statements on South China Sea, and it makes perfect sense because the US has trade interests in South China Sea. India has more than 55% of its trade passing through South China Sea. So there is that freedom of navigation as the commonality between US and India in the South China Sea. Although Indian position is that the South China Sea dispute has to be settled in a bilateral fashion. A.K. Anthony made that statement that we are not part of a dispute. We also suggest that this dispute has to be resolved at the bilateral level. That is China, Vietnam, China, Philippines, or whatever the bilateral. So initially we have expressed the opinion that we will not be a linchpin, but today we have the Act East Asia policy. So all this suggests there is, for the last few months, after the BJP new government took over, we have seen some forward momentum on the US-India relations. Prime Minister Modi spoke about democracy. This is the first Prime Minister speaking about democracy. Previously in 2001 to roughly 2014, we saw the Prime Ministers or Minister of External Affairs saying, we support democracy, but we support democracy in South Asia. But Modi spoke about democracy in Kyoto. Modi spoke about democracy in Fiji. Modi spoke about democracy in Washington DC. And Indian funding for the UN Democracy Fund is higher than the US contribution by about nearly $20 million. In other words, today India is now taking up that democracy-related issue. The second issue is the South China Sea, where we now say it is Act East Asia policy rather than simply looking east policy. Thirdly, in the joint vision with the United States, we mentioned both Indian Ocean and the South China Sea as part of a contiguous kind of Indo-Pacific. So in other words, there is a lot cooking up between US and India on this front. So these are some of the issues that I have for the strategic cooperation, competition, and the conflict-related issues between US, China, and India. My suggestion is that these relations are becoming intense. Strategic at one point, intense. There is a lot of competition, there is a lot of cooperation as well. There is a kind of soft balancing that is happening between the two. No one is entering into a hard alliance. Here are 2-3 countries. One, the global leader. Second, you have the number one in terms of population, China. Number two in terms of economy. Also a member of the United Nations Security Council. Third, you see a huge population, strategic depth, a rising country. So none of these are planning to have a hard alliance. Yet we see a lot of balancing is happening between all the three. As soon as the joint vision was signed, the US started suggesting we should have a trilateral between US, China, and India. So which suggests that there is, immediately after the Obama's visit, there is a rethinking in the United States as well on to what extent they will go with that of India. So all this suggests that the trilateral relation is becoming very intense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kondapalli. I think it was a formidable task to be able to decode and demystify the relationship between what I call as a preponderant power, that's the US, an ascendant power, which is China, and a rising power now, which is much more confident in the expression of its foreign policy, which is India and this new government. So without further ado, let me invite questions. Kindly keep your questions brief, so we can have more and more of the interaction. The floor is open.
Trade Center and Pentagon, whether that has affected relations between China and America?
Soon after the 9/11, I think one of the major beneficiaries of 9/11 is China. A few months before the 9/11, Bush administration identified China as a strategic competitor. And then the 9/11 happened, and then the US attention shifted to counterterrorism. This was the time that China needed
in the international system. And China worked assiduously in economic issues, in strategic issues, in military modernization. So much so today the United States cannot simply challenge China. So 9/11 actually came as a boon to the Chinese. Of course, 9/11 changed substantially the global architecture. We today had identified counterterrorism as #1 security challenge. We did that in 2001. The Minister of External Affairs annual report started saying counterterrorism or cross-border terrorism is the #1 security challenge for India. We no longer say this on other issues, but on cross-border terrorism, we maintain that as the #1 security challenge. The Chinese started saying 2 years ago, 3 evils is the #1 security challenge for them. 3 evils include separatism, extremism, and splitism. Basically, these mean their reservations on Taiwan, on Tibet, on Xinjiang, the events that are happening in these 3 places. So the 3 evils essentially mean domestic challenges to China. In other words, it's also in a way related to counterterrorism. The United States identified counterterrorism as its #1 kind of challenge after the 9/11 events. So I think this change had actually contributed to China's rise. In other words, United States was deflected to the counterterrorism imperatives and possibly lost the vision, as the Bush administration earlier identified, they lost the emerging kind of challenge from China. So I would say the 9/11 actually was a boon to China because China was not identified as the next Soviet Union by the Americans from that time on after the 9/11. But even in the case of China, China has been facing a lot of flack as a result of this Uyghur resistance to China in Xinjiang. From 1991, the Chinese started facing huge challenge in Xinjiang. Every year there are several hundred people killed, but of course over a period of time. In the last 2 years, there were 200 incidents in Xinjiang, where you have a number of violent incidents. The Uyghurs are opposing the Han Chinese entry into Xinjiang. So that is the basis for the resistance, the Uyghurs. For example, in 2009, in a span of 2 hours, the Uyghurs killed 189 people. We had the Mumbai attack. In a span of 24 hours, we had 145 casualties in Mumbai. In a span of 24 hours. But in Xinjiang, in a span of 2 hours, you had 189 casualties. But the Urumqi incident was never a global kind of front page news, while Mumbai attacks became the front page news for whatever reasons. So China is also actually facing a lot of flack internally. And last year, China had set up the National Security Commission, mainly to counter these internal challenges that it is facing in Xinjiang. So I would say the 9/11 provided some space to China, but today China is equally having problems.
Whether it has helped India some or the other way, 9/11 incident?
To some extent, there is some coordination between India, China, US. For instance, there is the joint intelligence coordination between China, India, US on the terrorism-related issue. The Home Ministry discusses some of these issues with the Chinese counterparts. And we, as you know, the US-India counterterrorism dialogue is also at a very high level. So there is a lot of coordination on the counterterrorism, mainly in financing, mainly in countering those training camps and so on. However, India doesn't get much help from China on counter-terrorism because the Pakistan factor and the all-weather kind of friendship that China has with Pakistan. So it's kind of muted. The India-China counter-terrorism cooperation is kind of muted.
Whether three these
Lastly, I'm a student of international relations, teaching at Pittsburgh in Goa campus. It's been a very fascinating, understanding of issues in the foreign affairs, particularly during the Cold War. I felt that a lot of jingoism was there, export of communism and all that, but understanding foreign policy was far more simpler. Today, I think the space of understanding has increased so much that its variety of things are coming in the picture. But if I try to simplify them to understand them in one or 2 points, I think the large part of the structure of foreign policy and the contours of foreign policy are cooked in the market. The economy and the economists are taken over the political scientists. The neoclassicalism of economics is much more riding than the political rest of the theories that I'm talking about. So the moment you talked about 60 platforms of engagement between US, China, 30 between US and India, we have nearly a dozen with Japan. Globally, if you put them together, and if you look at closely to all the platforms, 90% of those platforms contain the text or the language are around economic engagement, buying and selling and all that. So is the shift of foreign policy or the structure and the context of foreign policy shifting from the political spectrum to more of the market context? That's my one. Second, I have a quick, we have to have our own story. We have so far been either part of the American, Soviet and variety of engagements we have been trying to participate. Very often we have been accepted, rejected, predatory and variety of things. Trying to see China in variety of ways also. We very often feel that China must do it this way. We have an imagination of what China should do. But if you wear Chinese shoes, also try to understand the isolationism China has gone through. The international space China has received today has been also through a long process of contest. They have increased their capacity and accordingly they have expanded their ability in the international space. So if we see the market, if my understanding is correct, market is more cooking the foreign policy stories. We have a large foreign policy structure, huge market. You have a very, very large strength to begin with. What perhaps we may have to combine with that strength is a capacity in indigenously creating our own economic story. Perhaps we possibly would be much more viable in the international context than being part of any other stories. Thank you.
Indeed, I completely agree with this position. There has been an underlying economic-related issues in globalization. Most countries are evaluated on the basis of where they stand in the globalization, the global WTO rankings, FTAs that they have signed, FDI, capital flows, markets. These are the things which have become buzzwords after the globalization process. Except for North Korea and Cuba, possibly for every other country, those are the benchmarks in terms of the international relations. So indeed, that has been for the last at least 2 decades. That's been the major indicator, barometer in looking at the international power structures and so on. When Colin Powell came to India, somewhere in 2004 or so, he did not mention Pakistan for the first time. He mentioned about India should open up the markets, India should do this on economy issues, whereas everything related to economy, everything related to bilateral Every other US leader who visited India mentioned about Pakistan. But this is the first time in 2004 where we did not see the script the same as it was before. So at that time we were doing well. The growth rates were relatively high, and there is the economic footprint becoming very, very prominent. So in the case of US and India, the economic aspects are also catching up on not simply the strategic, the political, the other aspects of military issues, but also the economic issues, which are becoming very prominent. We are also discussing the IPR issues. We are also discussing the FTA related issues. We are discussing the market economy status. We are discussing the currency related issues. We are discussing a host of other in the economic field. In addition, of course, to those what it has become. In the Chinese case as well, there has been huge economic related aspects that have become the focus of the US-China bilateral relations. China moved up the value chain. They displaced the Japanese in the value chain. They have become the largest trading partner for 128 countries out of 190 odd countries we have. So the economic position is pretty robust in the case of China. Across the Indian Ocean, they have become the largest trading partner for everybody. Across the Pacific, have become the largest trading partners. So the economic issues are the basis of that discussion. So when in the State of the Union address, when Obama said mercantilism of China is actually posing a problem for the US leadership, I think he's underlying the economic market factor as part of the IR. He identified specifically that this is the issue. Why UK joins the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's a huge game changer. Australia is rethinking, South Korea is rethinking, Germany, France are rethinking about their initial opposition through the AIIB. And as you know, the US position is that this is part of Beijing consensus. AIIB is part of Beijing consensus, and it's moving away from the Washington consensus. Washington consensus would emphasize more on global governance issues, which is political and which is also the rule of law. Decided in 1945 the liberal world order, which is Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations system, the Alliance system, a host of other issues in 1945 when we had this current international world order. So the Chinese are subtly threatening this system. So I would say here economy is also politics. Here economy is gradually becoming politics. It's becoming global order. Economic issues are underlying under the global order related issues. That's what the US opposition is also doing. But it is well taken that it is market led. So obviously we also have to learn from this. China today is the mover and shaker because they earn $300 billion a month purely by manufacturing sector exports. It's not anything. They get the foreign exchanges based on manufacturing sector entirely. So it's hard-earned money. It's through sheer labor. They have done this, and the total money that we have in our pockets is about $290 odd billion foreign exchange reserves. Most of this is in FII and whatever the parking of money and whatever in the stocks. But in the case of China, it's hard-earned money. It's the exports. So they have indicated economic capacities have to be expanded. Any country which has to rise, it has to have its fundamentals right. And the fundamentals for China are right, except the fact that they entered into too much of interdependence. So much so that they are heavily dependent on the US, on the EU, on Japan, on South Korea, on ASEAN. If something happens in these countries, then China is tied down with all these countries.
I'm Rahul Tripathi from Department of Political Science, Goa University. My question would be more on the bilateral rather than the triangle, and that is with regard to our understanding of the Chinese mindset. Over the years, we've seen a growing interest on China in India, but then are we doing enough? What we have seen over the years is that the breeds of Sinophobes is perhaps increasing, and Sinophiles is not increasing to the extent it should have been. We had a Chinese scholar who came recently, and he mentioned that much of what comes across in the Chinese press is an outcome of the kind of reactions that they read which come in the Indian press. So it's like Indian jingoism feeds into the Chinese perceptions. So what is the extent to which at the moment India is trying to understand the Chinese mindset? And I think a person like you would be in the best position to answer that question. Particularly at a time when China is building up its own capacities with regard to its perceptions on international relations, developing a Chinese view. So where do we stand in terms of understanding the Chinese mindset? Because that will have a bearing in terms of how we look at the trilateral at some point of time.
Perceptions determining bilateral relations. That's a new trend in IRK. Perceptions alone determining bilateral relations. In the case of India and China, we keep saying we are civilizational states, which means we have a baggage of at least 3,000 years. So it's not just about today's perception or yesterday's perception, but huge baggage that we have of these thousands of years. In addition to the baggage, we have concrete issues, not just perceptions, but concrete issues. The concrete issues, India became independent in 1947, China liberated in 1949, as they say. But till now, the territorial dispute is not resolved. What it means is, if I want to go to the border areas and I cross an imaginary line, I would be entering into China. But the government of India had not determined that line. So I simply cannot cross that line. Neither the Chinese government had determined that line. What it means basically is, we are living in a Westphalian world order. The Westphalian world order is outlined by latitude and longitude. Where is your latitude, where is your longitude? The internal sovereignty, external sovereignty all flow from that. But the craziest thing about India and China is both do not know where their borders are. Even after 60 years of independence or liberation. This is the craziest thing, because we both are members of the United Nations, yet we do not have our own limits to the borders. So in international relations, it's quite fuzzy. I mean, it is an abnormality in the India-China relations that they have not been able to tackle the territorial dispute, despite 33 years of discussion. We, of course, experimented with various formula, but nothing really worked out. And tomorrow, 23rd, day after tomorrow, Ajit Doval will be meeting with the Yan Chechen for the 18th Special Representative. I will bet with you nothing will come out of this on the territorial dispute, because nothing has come out in the last 17 meetings, nothing will come out in this meeting as well. Both will make a statement on international relations and on other issues, but not on the territorial dispute. I will bet with you, after 2 days you can see the newspapers. What it basically means is that one of the most contentious issues has not been tackled. Obviously the perceptions of Indians will be factored in. India as a defeated country in 1962 will have a grouse on China. That's much like the Chinese were defeated by the Japanese in 1895, so the Chinese have a grouse on the Japanese. So the Chinese perceptions on Japan is highly negative. Why? Because they were defeated in 1895. Indian opinion on China will be negative because we were defeated in 1962. That's quite obvious. So while President Kalam said we forgot about 62 and all that, still we have these images being reproduced in the press and whatever. So these perceptions are built up for a period of time, which cannot be simply washed away. So when possibly Jia Haitao, who came here, if Jia Haitao says that the Indian perceptions are negative towards China, we should ask, why are Chinese perceptions negative on Japan? They have same issues, the territorial dispute, the whatever. So we should ask him, why are the Chinese perceptions negative on Japan? Why are so positive on India? We should also ask them why they keep continuing to support Pakistan in nuclear and ballistic missile field. Are the Pakistanis using these nuclear weapons on Afghanistan, on Iran, on Saudi Arabia, on US? In which war will the Pakistanis use the nuclear weapon? We should ask them, why are you supplying these technologies to Pakistan? We should also ask them, why are you supplying so and so to Sri Lanka, to whatever countries in the region? Jia Haitao has no answers to this. But for anyone sitting in the Prime Minister's office, these are the basic issues of bilateral relations. And bilateral relations influence them. Each and every time. Modi told Xi Jinping in September, after the first two paragraphs, he said, if the line of actual control is not defined and not stable, he said bilateral relations will be affected. It's the first time a Prime Minister told a President sitting beside him that we need to do something about the LAC. Because there were 1,000 troops as they were talking on Chumar area. So it influences definitely Indian opinion, Indian perception vis-a-vis China. China is sitting pretty. They just have to walk in, walk out to test the Indian leadership. So Indian perceptions would be highly negative. So we should immediately ask them, why are your perceptions negative towards Japan? Japan is today not saying they are going to attack China. Japan does not have nuclear weapons to attack China. Japan does not have expeditionary forces to attack China, like they did in 1920s. They do not have the wherewithal. In fact, today China is more powerful. So why do they hate the Japanese? Why are their perceptions so negative about Japan? I think in terms of perceptions, I think we first have to be clear about what are the basic issues. Basic issues are the territorial dispute. That is the identity of nations in a Westphalian world order. Unless until the territorial dispute is resolved, Modi cannot sleep peacefully. He has to, like Nehru has to be answerable to the people and say after 62 or even before 62 about the border. Modi also have to say about the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country. That's where instead of perceptions, it is the fundamental responsibility of that leader. The second issue, the Chinese argue about, and so on. Of course, we had some understanding on that issue. We have had, for instance, we are the only country which accommodated the Dalai Lama. United States did not accommodate, UK did not accommodate, Japan did not accommodate. Nobody else accommodated. Nobody else. If the Dalai Lama is going and meeting the Obama and the Chinese are making a comment, the Americans have reduced the level of contact with the Tibetans from the Oval Room to the Maple Room, and from Maple Room to taking the Dalai Lama from from the back door. But we have been hosting the Tibetans for the last 50 years, 55 years, and facing the flag. So we had substantial support to the Tibetans on that front. Of course, we did not cross the line. We did not say, for instance, gave arms and ammunition to the Tibetans to fight against the Chinese or whatever. But that is a real issue for which influences perceptions. Likewise, the other issues, the Indian Ocean, the neighborhood issues, Pakistan issues, these are issues which are concrete. Chinese scholars generally brush aside all this because they are sitting on a higher perch and they would brush it aside. But even in the Chinese press, Chinese nationalism in about 5 years' time will be directed against India as it is directed against Japan.
Hello sir, my name is Sainandan. I'm a student of MA International Studies, Goa University. India needs Chinese investments for our economic growth. But on the other hand, we also have so many security issues with China, Kashmir, Arunachal Pradesh, Indian Ocean and even South China Sea. So in this context, is it better if India's policies tilt a little bit more towards US in this triangle rather than remaining equidistant from US and China?
We first have to see where is the investment coming into India, in what way it is coming and what we should do about it. China's investment in India is $1.1 billion as of now, as of today. Indian investment in China is over $600 million. So roughly you can say almost the same amount. China has $4.2 trillion foreign exchange reserves. We have about $319 or so billion in foreign exchange reserves. Of course, this has to be converted into equity funds and then to be invested abroad as part of the. And then one also has to pass through the problems related to sovereign wealth fund investments because they come with some government intervention. So we have to be careful about the sovereign wealth funds as well. Having said that, if you look at the investment flows, US invested $100 billion in India. China invested $1.1 billion, right? Japan invested $16 billion in India. Netherlands, rest of Europe invested also in a huge amount. Singapore invested. All of these investments are several hundred times the Chinese investments. So why should we identify only China as an investment? Let us also look at where did China invest so far. The total Chinese investments abroad are about $250 billion so far. While they have $4.2 trillion, they have invested only $250 billion. Most of this, 80-90% of this is in the energy sector. In Angola, Sudan, Iran, Kazakhstan, in Natuna gas fields in Indonesia, in uranium fields in Australia, in Kazakhstan uranium fields. So their investment in Venezuela. So most of these investments are in the energy sector. Of course, they have also invested, or not invested, but gave loans. Anil Ambani got $10 billion loan from China Development Bank for the energy generation in India. So that's a loan, so we'll have to repay back and whatever. Not an investment. But, so most of this investment is in the energy sector. Of course, that's an area where we also have to focus on. So we are focusing on this $10 billion thing is into generating about 40,000 megawatts of electricity. So 10% of Indian electricity today is generated by the Chinese. So it is true that there is huge investment already. But energy is not everything. We also are looking at manufacturing sector. We are also looking at other sectors, infrastructure projects and so on. But Chinese investments in these are very, very minimal. During Xi Jinping's visit, they initially promised several $billion, but now reduced about $20 billion for 5 years. So $4 billion a year they will have to invest But even now, Xi Jinping came in September, and today we are in March. There is no substantial increase in the investment. They identified Pune and Ahmedabad as the manufacturing zones. Nothing is happening on the manufacturing. Let me tell you, nothing is happening on the manufacturing zones in these two areas. So we have to look at the overall picture and see where is the investment coming, what we should do in this. Number one, China is reluctant to invest generally abroad, and they have shown interest only in the energy sector. But that is not our priority, because we are not far away from Saudi Arabia. We can still import from whatever. Unlike China, which is about 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers, we are about just 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers. So it's not a, it's of course affecting us with the budget, because we are spending about $145 billion as part of our energy bills, oil imports. So that's a huge amount we are paying for this, but that is not where China is helping us. China is not helping us in the manufacturing sector. China is not helping us in the infrastructure projects as of now. So I do not know why we should lay down a red carpet to China, because so far the investments are not very high. If the investments are there, then we possibly can put up the red carpet.
Anybody else?
Good evening, sir. My name is Arif. I'm from Afghanistan. During the presentation, you mentioned some key points about Afghanistan. Considering the contestation, because the title of the lecture was contestation about three countries, and bearing in mind Afghanistan as a minor country, which needs the funds for development and nation building. What's the also I have some study of the political mentality of the leaders in India. What's the exact position of the Indian mentality concerning future of Afghanistan? So if you please share your opinion, and also if Dr. Latish, as a spokesperson of BGP, offer his mentality and point of view.
Because I have no expertise on India, focus on China. But whatever I know, I want to share with you on this. In the case of China in relation to Afghanistan, this is quite a strange situation. They found in 1970s. When the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan, we were relatively silent. Of course, we said, Indira Gandhi said, outside forces should withdraw from the region. So it's an indirect comment on the Soviet Union, but we had an alliance system with the Soviet Union, so we had some constraints on that front. But she dispatched a foreign secretary to Islamabad. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Hua came to India in '79. So we were also concerned about the Soviet presence in Afghanistan at that point in time. But we didn't do much. The Chinese did a lot, but a lot actually became a problematic later on. What did the Chinese do? Like the CIA, the Chinese also trained the Mujahideen. The Chinese set up 250 training units, and they trained thousands of Mujahideen. Now the Mujahideens took a different avatar. Now they are all Taliban. Some of them Al-Qaeda. The Chinese military intelligence trained them, the Mujahideen. Like the ISI in Pakistan, they trained them, or the CIA trained them. Now they are all facing problems in Xinjiang and other places. The Chinese estimate that the East Turkestan Islamic movement has about 1,200 cadres trained by the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and in Fatah region in Pakistan. So this has become a major issue for China today vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So what are these countries doing in the post-ISAF situation from last Christmas? The post-ISAF, we were concerned about the spread of terrorist-related incidents. So India actually is coordinating with China on Afghanistan. In 2010, for the first time, we had a structured dialogue with China. Shiv Shankar Menon, the National Security Advisor, went to Beijing and he discussed this issue with China. So what we did in Afghanistan was we had a coordination meeting. We both decided that we want to change the discourse in Afghanistan. The discourse in Afghanistan is about terrorism. So we said we want to change this by looking at economic issues. So we spent a lot in the road construction, railway construction, the Chabahar project and other things. In addition, India and China, we agreed to invest in the iron and steel industry. There is an estimate that Afghanistan is now sitting on $3 trillion worth of raw materials, mainly iron ore and copper. So one of the estimates is if you exploit these resources, then Afghanistan will prosper and Afghanistan will have states created. Afghanistan will have less incentives to focus on terrorism and more incentives in making money.
Thank you very much. Srikanth, you want to say something? Okay, so let me just say this, that the relationship is complex as was presented. There are streaks of all three, essentially contestation, competition from time to time. But I think the most sane explanation would be that enlightened self-interest in a period of interconnectedness and interdependence will make all these three entities collaborate and cooperate from time to time so as to maintain peace, security and stability for the benefit of society. I think with this, let me request Mr. Kapurkar to kindly present our distinguished speaker with a memento as a token of our appreciation for coming here and taking time out. With this, we call the proceedings to end. Thank you. Good night.